Hello and welcome back to our podcast here at Manor Park Classics. And in our December auction last month, we were very fortunate to have an example of BMC's Farina Saloon, their mid-sized family saloon from the 1950s and 1960s that was badge engineered to oblivion. The example we had in was a lovely Riley 472, the kind of top-of-the-ladder version of that car. And I was fortunate enough to make a feature on that car for our YouTube channel and to go across our social media. And on Facebook in particular, that car did extraordinarily well. Hundreds of thousands of people saw that little 20-30-second video on Facebook. And so I thought it proved a good starting point for us to discuss badge engineering, to discuss such a central theme to that car and that video that I made, and talk about how it came to be, why it came to be, and what came out of it in the end. So at our auctions over the past few months and indeed years, we've also had cars like Wolseley Hornets and Riley 1500s, other examples of badge engineered versions of BMC cars from the 1960s and the 1950s in the case of the 1500, I will be honest as well. And they all sit as slightly different examples of how that badge engineering worked, how it related across models, across the entire model range and mark range of BMC as well. But to start with, we'll discuss how badge engineering came to be. So BMC, or the British Motor Corporation, was formed in 1952 as a merger between two of Britain's motoring giants, Austin and Morris, and they each brought with them a plethora of additional marks that they had either created or they'd bought over the past. And so suddenly we had Austin, Morris, MG, Wolseley, Riley and Van den Plas as well. There were 6 major constituents to BMC, though Austin and Morris were the main companies. And you could say maybe as well you have MG as their own operation to the side of Morris as well, but they came from Morris and they answered to Morris. And it's not exactly unusual for a major car manufacturer to begin swallowing other marks, but to end up in a situation where you have Austin and Morris each vying for power within one group, complete with all their constituent marks, it gets quite silly quite quickly. And so when Austin and Morris merged in 1952, the thought process was that they would rationalise down, not necessarily the marks, but they would rationalise down their model range at least, to make the Austins and Morrises relate to each other in different ways, to be essentially the same car. And so in 1952, you could go out and buy either an Austin A30 or you could buy a Morris Minor, of course. They were different cars, and after the merger, they very quickly gained the same engine, which makes a lot of sense. It saves that bit of money. But the thought process was that when these cars are replaced, they will be replaced with one unified model. And in 1958, that is what we saw in the form of the Farina Saloon, named after its stylist, Pininfarina, and it existed across all these different marks. But they existed in what seemed at the time at least to be a very sensible manner, in that they were essentially trim levels. So you could buy your basic run-of-the-mill everyday Austin or Morris, which were essentially the same. And then it is a bit silly to have two cars, two different marks should I say, that are essentially the same, the Austin Cambridge and the Morris Oxford. But building upon those cars, you then have the MG Magnet, which is sports-facing. You could then buy a Wolseley 1560 or later 1660, which is luxury-facing. You could have a Riley 468, later Riley 472, which was still luxury-facing, but with a bit of that sporting character assumed within it, sat slightly higher up the range again. And there wasn't a Van den Plas version of the Farina Saloon, but Van den Plas would sit at the very top of that model range as an ultra-luxury example. That same idea was then used 4 years later when they launched the 1100, or 8016, as it was known internally most often as the Morris and Austin 1100. You could buy an MG 1100, or a Wolseley 1100, or a Van den Plas Princess 1100, or a Riley Kestrel, of course. And they all sat as different trim levels, and in 1950s Britain and early 1960s Britain, that made a lot of sense. People in Britain are very class-oriented. Whether we like it or not, we always look at ourselves compared to our peers, and especially in that time period, people wanted to feel as though they had something about them, and so they could afford to go out and spend the extra money on a Wolseley, as opposed to a meagre, run-of-the-mill Morris 1100, for example. The problem is that then that dilutes the individual marks. And so while everybody knows BMC, they're still having to be marketed on their own. So you wouldn't see, it was very rare at least to see an advertisement for the BMC 1100 as a whole. You would see an advertisement for an MG 1100, just on its lonesome, that single car. And so it just confused and diluted things and meant that they had to spend more money on marketing, and it all became a bit fragmented, especially when it comes to the dealer network, because the dealer network was just ludicrous at this point. You couldn't buy Morrises from Austin dealers, you could only buy Rileys as well as Austins at Austin dealers. If you wanted a Wolseley, you had to go to a Morris dealer. It was a bit of a mess. It didn't make much sense, and then along came Ford, who just had one overall mark. Ford, they had blue ovals on every car, but they applied trim levels to the boot lid of their cars. So in the late 1960s, for example, you could have a Cortina 1300L, or you could have a Cortina 1600E. And all the little bits of flashiness around the car proved that it was something more than your run-of-the-mill base model Cortina, if you had a 1600E, that is. And while those at BMC, there was a clear distinguishment between the Austins and the MGs, for example, it was all fragmented, and people were starting to wane away from that those traditional marks, and they were starting to look at a slightly more classless motor industry where they didn't feel the need for the stuffiness of those big upright grills on those classic British cars. So Ford could instead look at their model range and advertise just for the Ford Cortina. And they could therefore spend so much less money and get so much more brand recognition. The individual marks, as a result, within BMC were starting to fail slightly. They were losing their social standing as they didn't really stand for anything anymore. Instead, they were just badge-engineered versions of the same car. And if you're trying to create different brands, like the Volkswagen Group today do, for example, you need to have them easily distinguishable. What is it about a Porsche Cayenne that feels different to a Bentley Bentayga or a Lamborghini Urus or a Volkswagen Touareg? They feel like quite different cars, and that's what BMC was lacking. And so rather than just doing different trim levels on the back of the car like Ford ended up doing, BMC, with good intentions and what sounded very sensible in the 1950s before people had really started doing this, had started to fail them by the mid-1960s. Now, there are certain examples of these cars that are like the modern Volkswagen Group. So take the Wolseley 1500 that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. The Wolseley 1500 and the Riley 1.5 were the same cars, but they were evolutions upon the Morris Minor. But they felt very different to the Morris Minor. They had a larger engine, they felt more grown up, they were more sophisticated, they looked totally different. And what had actually started out as a Morris Minor replacement project culminated in the 1957 launch of both the Wolseley 1500 and the Riley 1.5. BMC didn't really see the need to replace the Morris Minor. After all, it was the first British car to sell over 1 million units, but it made sense, therefore, to have cars that shared a lot of their platform, that shared a lot of their mechanical components, but felt different. So you could buy a Morris Minor if you liked, but you could go that step up and buy a Wolseley 1500. Or if you wanted twin carburettors and you wanted leather upholstery, you wanted more power and a rev counter, for example, you bought the Riley version. There's still kind of that trim level thing sat within the Wolseley and the Riley, but they sit as being very different to the standard Morris Minor counterpart. And that continued through some of their cars, but not all of them. I mentioned the 1100, for example, and they were all just very badge engineered. But the Mini, on the other hand, was slightly different. So in 1959, they launched the standard Austin and Morris versions of the Mini, which were essentially the same. Just legacy is the reason there was both Austin and Morris versions. But you could then buy in 1962 a Wolseley Hornet, a car we've had in at Manor Park a couple of times before. Or you could then buy a Riley Elf, which had a little bit more equipment, which was a little bit more sophisticated, but they looked very different because, of course, the Hornet and the Elf had a proper boot on the back of the Mini and they had a totally different front end. So there's platform sharing going on there, reducing the cost of a new Wolseley or Riley, but maybe with that shared Mini centre section, the sharing was a bit too obvious, and it shows as we get towards the end of the 1960s that BMC realise that this can't continue. Having seen what Ford were doing with their trim levels, they realised that Austin and Morris are still their most prestigious marks. They may be the mainstream ones, but they're the ones that everyone knows. And if they're going to compete with Ford, or kind of stay in touch with Ford, should I say, then they're going to have to emphasise the benefits of buying an Austin or a Morris. Now, of course, they could have done with just cutting down. Let's say they get rid of Morris, for example, and they just stick with Austin. That might have been much more sensible at this stage, but never ever put BMC, or now British Leyland, in the same sentence as sensible. It just doesn't work. But we see the death of Riley in 1969, and that kind of end of the 1100 range that was once occupied by the Riley version, and also the MG 1100 is replaced by an all-new Austin or Morris 1300 GT. That makes so much more sense than having this badge-engineered counterpart, and it also looked much more youthful. It didn't have that classic upright MG grille sat at the front of it that really aged those cars and pushed them towards a much more elderly audience than maybe a Mark I Ford Escort or a Mark II Ford Cortina might otherwise encounter. And when a new range of cars is launched in the early 1970s, we don't see an MG version of the Morris Marina. We also don't see a Riley version of the Austin Allegro. Instead, we have the Marina TC and the Allegro SS, each sitting within the Morris and Austin frameworks respectively. Now, it's often said that in the early 1970s, British Leyland had designed two cars, the Marina and Allegro, that competed with one another. But that's not really true, because they tried to differentiate Austin and Morris. They realised that having the same cars with the same names was just quite stupid. And again, they took a leaf out of Ford's book and decided to build cars that competed directly with them. Now, BMC in the 1960s were producing some of the most modern family cars in the world. They went front-wheel drive, hydroelastic suspension, wheel at each corner, etc. We've been through it all 1,000 times already. But this meant that their cars were very avant-garde, and that Ford were building quite classically engineered rear-wheel drive, usually live-axle leaf-sprung cars that were very friendly to fleets, very cheap to buy, cheap to maintain, and cheap for Ford to build as well. They can make a big profit on these cars, as opposed to BMC, who were making losses on all of their cars. And so they decided that Austin were going to carry on being avant-garde, and Morris were going to be Ford clones, in a way. So they launched the Morris Marina in 1971 as a quick hash-up that would only last for a few years on sale. And that didn't really end up happening, did it? And would compete kind of with the Ford Cortina, but it would sit really in between Escort and Cortina. Whereas the Austin Allegro, on the other hand, would be an Escort competitor, sure, but it would sit in a very different theme to the Morris Marina. It would be that avant-garde, that front-wheel drive, fluid suspension car that was very, very different to the Morris Marina. So this new form of differentiation was actually to build totally different cars. This was no longer badge engineering. They decided to almost get rid of badge engineering, really, and to build two separate lines of cars. And for a company that doesn't really have any money, designing two different cars and expecting huge profits from it is not really the way to go. And very quickly they realised that that wasn't going to work out. Indeed, the Marina and the Allegro were the only two cars ever launched with this mindset of Austin avant-garde and Morris conventional. By 1975, when they launched the Princess, or the car that became known as the Princess, they were originally badged as the Morris was the base model, the Austin was the mid-range level, and the Wolseley was the top-of-the-range car. But that coincides with the time when British Leyland went bankrupt. The Ryder report, which suggested British Leyland be nationalised, called out the badge engineering the company was so fond of over the recent years and realised that was not a good idea. It diluted the core brands, and so instead they reckoned that it should just all be badged as Leyland. That way you'd stop Austin and Morris people from fighting amongst each other, of course, but what kind of, cachet does the Leyland name have? And the answer, of course, is none. But there were a few cars that were then badged as Leyland cars, and so they could be sold across a number of different dealerships. They could be sold at either Austin or Morris dealerships before eventually they converged into being one dealership eventually. And so you could buy a Leyland Mini or a Leyland Princess or even a Leyland Maxi. They no longer carried Austin or Morris badging on the cars. They were just Leyland products. So that is what came out of British Leyland's bankruptcy, a total rejection of this badge engineering, and instead just call them all Leyland cars. But that wasn't very popular, and of course everybody still referred to them by their marks. So nobody refers to a late Maxi as a Leyland Maxi. It doesn't say Austin on it, but everybody knows it as an Austin. And it's the same with a Princess. People so often refer to them as Austin Princesses, in spite of them never having been badged in that way in period. But the Austin Princess, as I shall absolutely definitively name it, because it's stupid to otherwise, the cachet just wasn't there, as I mentioned. And so by 1978, the new leadership at British Leyland, led by Sir Michael Edwards, had essentially ripped up the Ryder report and decided, rather than dealing with this huge sprawl that British Leyland had now become, they would really water it down and start from scratch, get back to a small core company and try to rebuild something out from there. This, of course, led to the formation of the Austin Rover Group in 1982, but before then, they made it clear that the traditional marques were back. Back in the 1960s, the new overlord at British Leyland had decided that all of the individual marques should lose their logos. So no Austin badge or Morris badge, the traditional badges, the emblems, were on the cars. Instead, they just had little Leyland roundels that said Austin or Morris next to them, etc. And so, at the British Motor Show in 1978, British Leyland launched a new range of brochures which had these traditional crests, emblems on the front of them. It was clear that the traditional marques were back and that they were here to stay. They were here to be embraced, at least to a certain point. But of course, they had to be watered down into something coherent. And so eventually, Morris was killed off. MG was made into the sports-facing brand, so you could buy an MG Metro, an MG Maestro, or MG Montego. But Triumph was gone as well. Riley and Wolseley were certainly gone, and instead, all of the normal passenger cars were badged as Austins. This finally makes sense after so many years of wrangling and trying to get it right, something that would have been so easy if you just listened to the people at Ford and just choose one and stick with it from the outset. But it was the early 1980s, 1984, I think, by the time that they were all badged finally as Austins. The problem, of course, is that over the preceding decades, the Austin brand has been watered down to a point, and it's received such a bad reputation that people view Austins as being cars for old people. And so at the end of the 1980s, they decided to do it all over again and rebrand themselves simply as Rover, taking the name of the executive cars that were being built at the beginning of the 1980s and just applying that to the entire range. But as I mentioned about Austin becoming devalued, of the original intentions of Austin cars just being lost to history through all this wrangling over so many years, Rover arguably suffered the same fate in the early 1990s. What was previously a very proud marque was now being referred to as just Austins with Rover badges, which did nothing to help the Rover brand, only worsen it further. And so by the early 2000s, there's very little left. So we've reached a point here where over the course of this story, we've gone from a point of a huge conglomerate with a load of different subsidiaries, all having slightly different kind of values, brand values within them, then being watered down to a single brand, really, in the case of Rover. MG, I suppose, but only as more sports-facing versions of them, that had very little brand recognition left in it. It had very few values. And the reason I mention this today, and the reason I think it's worth discussing, is because of how this relates to the modern motor industry. So all of that on paper, any individual era within this story I've just told makes some sense. In the 1950s, it makes sense to have these once proud marques all be their own individual trim levels, as long as, of course, your overall company is well known enough. But then to try and build all kinds of different cars led to financial ruin. And then by that point, it's too late to rebadge them all as the same thing. And so are there certain car manufacturers in the world today that could do with learning a little bit from this story? Certainly we see a point in the British car market now where Vauxhall have lost all of their power. Vauxhall, of course, were swallowed by Stellantis a few years ago, and who's to say what's to come out of that? Certainly some of the cars that are coming through now have a little bit to say for them. There is something about some of the more modern Vauxhalls that is coming back to prominence, but in terms of actual success, people are now less willing to buy Vauxhalls than they have in Britain for the last 70 years, more than 70 years even. And so we're at a potential crossroads in the modern motor industry where very proud classic marques, like Wolseley were in the 1950s, they might be looking at oblivion, because being a part of a much wider group which has public perception sitting on them, a big conglomerate which is controlling these car brands, but they're not managing them all that well. So across all these years of this story, it all comes together to potentially teach us something about the modern motor industry and what we might either be about to encounter, or it might be a warning story from the past, that if a large group does take ownership of many different car brands, they need to manage the individual heritage of each of these marques in a very careful manner. The Volkswagen Group has proven itself more than capable of doing that. Over the years, Skoda has done its own thing. Skoda has its own brand identity that is better than Skoda's brand identity ever has been before. Porsche have not been punished for using Volkswagen bits in all of their cars. Porsche are in a better position than they ever have been. Lamborghini are in a better position than they ever have been. You could even say Bentley are in a better position than they ever have been before. That is how you manage these individual brand identities, through a bit of platform sharing towards success. But alternatively, we see a company like Stellantis, who is seriously faltering. And of course, Stellantis in the UK, the most famous marque, is Vauxhall, who was only swallowed by Stellantis from General Motors about 4 or 5 years ago, there or thereabouts. And over that time, Vauxhall has fallen from being one of the most popular car marques in the UK to being now out of the top 10 in terms of brands. They don't have a car in the top 10. People in Britain are now less willing to buy a Vauxhall than they ever have been in history. And is that because what Vauxhall did well at various points in their history is now not being allowed to flourish? Or is there not a new brand identity being built out for it? Are they just regurgitating rebadged versions of other Stellantis models? You can also look at new Alfa Romeos and question how well they're going to do when the public perception is overwhelmingly negative towards Stellantis. They can put in all the work they want to do to make a car feel as much like a traditional Alfa Romeo or a Lancia or a Citroën or a Peugeot, etc. as they like. But if they don't allow the individual brands to flourish and to remain independent and to appear semi-independent, then where does it take us? Now, you can look at various points in BMC's history. and say there were bits of the Volkswagen Group in there, there are bits of Stellantis today, and of course, there are vast swathes of things that were nothing like either of those two modern, huge car companies, and that led directly to BMC's downfall, where they just could not get a grip of the brands they had. But at various different points, it made a lot of sense to do what they did. It's only when it all comes together in the full discourse of history that we start to realise that maybe it wasn't quite the best thing to be doing. So hopefully for some of the nerds amongst you, that was an interesting little bit of automotive history. And I always like relating it to something more modern because, we can potentially learn things from our history. But I do hope you enjoyed that little walk down memory lane because BMC, British Leyland, etc., they just fascinate me so much. I am absolutely a broken record, but I do hope you enjoyed it, and please do tune in for more of these soon.